Listen!
This video today is not sponsored by ExpressVPN.
DSSF.
Hey everyone, I know I just released a C700 video a couple days ago. I wanted to release another one, a shorter one. That one was about 55 minutes. This one's probably, hopefully not going to be more than 20. This will be a complete tutorial on how to use C700 VST. For those who don't know, C700 is a VST that emulates the Super Nintendo sound chip. It allows you to create Super Nintendo music, play it off of a real hardware, with some exceptions, and I'll get into that. So here are the features and the limitations of the SPC700. The first limitation, of course, is that you only have 8 channels to work with. You can only have 1 voice per channel. The second limitation, of course, is memory. It's called ARAM, which is audio RAM, or SRAM, which is sound RAM. This memory is shared between sound effects and music sequences, the samples that drive both of those, the driver data for the actual sound driver for the game, and echo. One unique feature of the sound chip that the PlayStation 1 sound chip actually has as well is pitch modulation. We'll get into that later. The SNES can output at a sample rate of up to 128 kilohertz. When you have samples that play higher than that, the pitch will loop back around. I'll get into that a little bit later. The SNES's general output sample rate is 32 kilohertz. That's not exactly 32 kilohertz. It can be 32,050, 32,020, 32,071. Every Super Nintendo plays back at a different rate, which means every Super Nintendo will have different pitches, different speeds. Some of them slow down a little bit more depending on the temperature in the room. It's all based on the timing crystal within the system. It's got an amplifier ADSR and a gain envelope that C700 doesn't currently support. It also has a very popular echo effect that everybody knows about, but not so well known is that the echo has a filter capability to it, which can create very interesting resonant filter effects within the echo. So there's a couple ways you can try to find the C700 VST. The easiest way, of course, is to use Google. So if you search up C700 VST, you'll find a few links here, some videos. These websites are not Asoman's website. Asoman is the person who created C700. This one is his website, the one that's picose.com. So you can either do the Google search for the C700 or just type in picose.com up here, and that will take you to his website. Now everything's in Japanese. I have Google automatically translating to English for me. But the easiest way to find it is just to go to the website, click the C700 link, and then the download links are right here. So you can download it for Mac or for Windows. I have a Windows machine, so that's the one I download. If you want to output to SPC or SMC format, you will also need to download this playercode.bin file. We'll get to where you have to set that up later in the video. So I'm not going to go into full detail on how to install a VST into a DAW. That's really not part of this video. We're going to assume you know how to do that. If you are having trouble, contact your DAW or MIDI sequencer's creator. In my case, I'm going to be using Cakewalk. So in Cakewalk, I'm just going to right-click, insert an instrument, and choose the C700 VST. So here's the interface. It's a little complicated, so let's go through all the features one by one. Here at the top, we have the channel numbers. They go from 1 to 16. When you highlight a channel and you assign a sample to it, by default that sample should be playing on that channel, unless of course you have a patch change set. And above the channel numbers are the number of voices playing currently in that channel. On the second row, you have a polyphony count, which allows you to set the number of voices so you don't accidentally go over your allotted range. Some games had a limit of 6 voices, and the reason was so that channels 7 and 8 could be reserved for sound effects. You can also set the pitch bend range. This is great if you have some portamento being done by a pitch controller or envelope automation in your DAW. It's got an engine option which allows you to have compatibility with older versions of C700. There's a relaxed feature which allows you to go past the 64K RAM limit. And then there's accurate, which is what you would choose if you were wanting to stick to hardware limitations. Voice allocation is if you want to have C700 output to a channel priority system. And what that does is it plays a voice on the last channel that went silent, or you can set it to be channel to channel. So in other words, MIDI channel 1 is SNES channel 1. The velocity curve option will allow you to have 3 different settings. The first one is that if you don't want any dynamic changes in your notation, there's a flat curve. The second curve is logarithmic, the third curve is linear. And that just changes the dynamic style of the keys being pressed. Multibank A, B, C, and D are just different groups where you can assign different samples to those groups, like drum kits or key splits. We'll get deeper into that later in the video. The vibrato depth and vibrato rate allows you to configure the pitch depth of your continuous controller 01 or the modulation controller and how fast it will modulate. Unfortunately, as of this time, you can only have sine wave based vibratos. You can't change it to a pulse wave or a triangle or a sawtooth. You should also be very careful about using continuous controllers with C700. We'll talk about that later on as well. Bank A, B, C, and D works with the multibank feature above. It allows you to assign a sample to work with that specific multibank. High key and low key will set the notational range for that sample. Root key is the coarse adjustment so that you can transpose your sample if needed. Auto is C700 attempting to find middle C based on its own algorithm. Here's a hint, it's not very good. The SNES has a limitation for loop points. It loops every 16 samples, which can make it very hard to loop without clicking. The good news is you can import wave files with loop points in them. C700 will attempt to resample them to make it so that they loop properly. This may not always be possible with shorter samples, so sometimes you'll need to import samples with loops already pre-baked into the waveform. The sample rate is how fast the sample is played at middle C. Best practice is try to make sure that your sample is tuned when you record it. The auto button will attempt to tune the sample for you, but the algorithm isn't perfect. And similar to the root key auto function, you may have problems with C700 tuning it to the wrong octave. Priority note on and release basically just means that if you have a low voice count, then samples that have a higher priority will take precedence over samples that don't. Sample slot number will allow you to choose whichever sample you want as default for that channel that's highlighted at the top. Or you can select the sample that you want by changing the patch number within your MIDI sequencer. With a maximum of 99 samples that you can load, it can be very hard to track them all. So this field will allow you to name them so that you know which samples are which. Unfortunately, some MIDI sequencers don't translate over the C700 sample naming structure properly for the MIDI patches, so you'll have to do the old school thing and create a spreadsheet. And of course, here's a preview of the waveform for the sample that you currently have highlighted. Preemphasis is sort of a high shelf filter that helps the sample cut through the SNES Gaussian interpolation. Without it, the sample can sound very muddy, especially if the sample is lower quality. Here we have the load, save, export, unload features that allow you to load BRR samples either from an SPC, or you can import wave files that have loop points in them, as well as export to a Fast Tracker XI instrument file. Or if you want, you can also just save to a BRR sample for use in other SNES sound drivers. So this is taking a little bit longer than I was hoping it would take, so I'm going to try to breeze through this next part. In this little section, we have most of the effects for the sample. The first one is echo, which turns on and off the echo for the specified sample. The next is P-mod, which is pitch modulation, or the FM effect that the SNES can do. We'll definitely be talking about that one. The next is hardware-generated noise. It's always wise to have a very short sample for the noise generator, because otherwise you're wasting your ARAM. The feature after this is mono, which makes it so that the sample can only play one voice at a time. This is essential if you're trying to use effects like slurring or legato, which Final Fantasy games were very well known for. After that, we have glide and rate, which is a portamento command. Basically, you can slide from one pitch or one note to another. And then we have the volume left and right. C700 doesn't have any panning functions that you can set to the sample. The only way you can default pan a sample is by arranging the left and the right volume knobs in such a way that it can pan to the speaker that you want it in. Finally, that little chaos button is just a random 48-byte sample generator. Here we have the sample's ADSR. The AR is the attack rate. That's how long it takes the sample to go from no volume to max volume for that sample. The DR is the decay rate, which is how fast the amplitude will decay from the max volume to the sustain level, which is the next one. The sustain level does not go down to 0. However, the SR1 does. Once the sound has decayed into the SL, then the SR1 triggers. When a note is playing, this will have the note fade out automatically down to silence at a predetermined rate. SR2 is sustain release 2. It will have a fade out after the note is released, but only if enable release is checked. The main volume, or M-vol, is the volume for all the sounds in the song. The echo volume, or the E-vol, is the volume for every sound that is affected by the echo effect. For both the main and the echo volume, you can set their values to minus, which would flip the polarity of their waveforms. But you want to be very careful when you use surround effects, especially when you're summing to mono, because you could phase cancel your sound out. Delay time is how fast the echo is. You have 16 settings for this, and the C700 will use 2 kilobytes per setting. So if you're trying to output on hardware on an SFC file, you want to be very careful with the amount of memory you're using. Feedback is the rate at which the echo will repeat into itself as it decays. When you set it to 127, it's never ending, especially when you have your filter. The filter is sort of an EQ for your echo. You could technically set some resonant effects here, but if you have your feedback set too high, that's a recipe for making yourself go deaf. You also run the risk of crashing your DAW's sound engine. We have the set recorder section, which allows you to save SPC files or SMC files. We'll get into that later. And then finally, we have the amount of memory that you have to use. The SNES has 64K, and C700 will let you know when you're nearing it. Careful though, sometimes if you go over, you'll actually cause your samples to corrupt. Whew, okay, we're finally done. By default, C700 comes with a few single cycle waveforms. A sine wave with a number of pulse waves with varying widths. However, you may not want to use these, so there's a number of samples C700 can import. You can load SPC files, which are SNES music files that you can find online via Google. BRR files that you may have converted in the past. BRR samples will be auto-tuned, as BRR does not have metadata to work with unless you're saving BRR files from C700. And finally, you can import wave files. They'll be converted to BRR. They'll be tuned automatically as well as resampled so that the contained loop points within that wave file can conform to the 16 sample loop points limitation of the SNES. It's sounding a bit dry, so let's add some echo to it. So as mentioned in the overview, the echo effect does use available ARAM. The longer the delay setting, the more ARAM being used. There's 16 settings, and that tacks on 2 kilobytes each setting. You can set the default volume for the effect, and with some clever automation capabilities in your DAW, you can even set up a ping pong effect. Keep in mind that sudden changes in these volume settings can cause your C700 to click. You can also play around with the feedback setting to get the ideal length of your echo's tail. Be mindful of your feedback settings though. Anything too long and you'll get a nasty sounding feedback loop, especially if you have custom settings in the EFR. Speaking of EFR, it's a filter for the echo. It'll take some playing around to figure out some ideal settings. However, if you know the coefficient settings that you want to use, C700 allows you to enter them in the blank fields above the faders. Ideal settings for the echo mostly depend on the kind of sound you're going for. The SNES sound chip allows you to set the echo on a channel basis, but C700 will only enable it on a sample basis. Just like with real reverb though, you may not want to add echo to all of your sounds. Having echo on things like drums or bass can actually muddy up your low-end mix. You also cannot send the echo depth independently. The echo is either on at max or off. You'll also want to be a little bit mindful about your echo volume settings. Typically good settings usually have echo by at most halfway of the main volume. But again, it all depends on the kind of sound you're going for. So now that we have echo explained, we should probably set up some drum kits. Drum kits aren't hard to set up at all. So say you want to switch between a kick and a snare. There's a couple of ways to do so. You can change the patch back and forth between a kick and a snare, but this is extremely tedious. The better way of doing it is using the multibank feature. You would enable the multibank group that you're going to be setting up. Then you'd be setting up the bank letter that corresponds to that multi-group bank. So in this example, we'll set up the kick to be note 60 and the snare to be note 64. The DAW or MIDI sequencer that you're using should have a way to figure out which notes pertain to which numbers. But if you're not sure, there are note charts that you can search online for. Once you've decided which notes you want to set your samples to, you'll need to configure their note ranges. High key is the highest note that sample will play. Low key is the lowest note that sample will play. If you're setting up drums, it's easiest just to set both the high and the low keys the same, unless you plan on having multiple pitches for a sample. Here's actually a good example of that. This is Chrono Trigger's Robo theme. The snare actually changes pitch. Once your range is set, you can tune the sample by changing the root key or adjusting the sample rate of the sample. Next, all you have to do is set up the MIDI track to use the SNES channel that you want, and then tell it to use one of the samples in the bank that you're trying to play. Now, to trigger the drums, all you have to do is play the notes that the samples are assigned to. Remember that you can set default volume and panning on each sample. In this example, I have the hi-hats set to their own bank and panned mostly to the right. Key splits can also be done this way, except instead of drums, you just use melodic samples. This is effective if you want to have a main lead instrument that will be changing back and forth, for example, an oboe and a flute. Wow, that's some good sounding noise. Speaking of which, the C700 isn't just a sample-based sound chip. You might be a little surprised to know that it also has hardware-based noise generation. It's quite odd that some specific games didn't use the noise generation in music though, but there could be some reasons for that. The noise is generated via a noise clock, which means you can only have one pitch of noise playing at a time. This means that if a song were to use a noise generator on one channel, and a sound effect tries to use that noise generator on another channel at a different pitch, both of the noise channels would be affected. It's easy to enable noise. You would just select a sample and check the noise generator option. However, because the noise is tacked onto a sample, common practice for games, especially from Squaresoft, is to latch the noise onto a very small single cycle sample. The reason is because the sample is still loaded into memory, so you'll want to be mindful about which samples you're assigning the noise to. Combining ADSR with C700's multi-bank feature provides some interesting things that we can do. It's almost like an NES, isn't it? Now I'll show you a feature that the SNES has that can put that noise generation to good use. A feature often underused on the SNES or even the PS1 is pitch modulation. It seems to be a bit of a black sheep sound feature as not many companies used it, not even Nintendo themselves. Squaresoft was one of the companies that did use it extensively, especially for sound effects. One of the reasons why it wasn't used very often is because it often uses too many channels. Pitch modulation, also known as frequency modulation, can be easily explained by people smarter than me, but to dumb it down so that I at least attempt to meet this 20-minute mark on this video, which I'm probably going to fail, it's as simple as you have a modulator channel playing a waveform. Its pitch and amplitude manipulates the pitch of the carrier channel playing another waveform. Pitch modulation effect can vary from Super Famicom to SNES to emulator. The overall sound is pretty much the same, but because every C700 has different timing crystals, no pitch modulation will sound exactly alike. The modulator channel can have its volume set to 0 so you won't hear the modulating channel's sound. When you change the pitch of the carrier channel and even add an echo, you can get all sorts of really cool sound effects. Adding an ADSR on the modulator also affects the carrier. Let's try making a quick sound effect. Maybe something like wind? So you can see I made two Super Nintendo sound channels. The first one's going to be the modulator, the second one's going to be the carrier. I'm setting up the channel structure right now and the program structure. The first channel is going to be a low-pitched sound. The second channel is going to be a higher-pitched sound. You just get a better effect when you're modulating a higher pitch with a lower pitch. And here's the effect. Sounds neat, but let's hear how it sounds with noise. That's cool, but you can still hear the original noise, so let's mute the modulator. So that's the kind of effect you get. You can get cooler effects too if you change the pitch of the carrier wave. Oh, I forgot to change the pitch bend range. Let's try changing the pitch of the modulator to be lower a bit. Wow, you get kind of a computer bleepy effect when you have a very low-pitched noise. Musically, it might be hard to integrate this into a song. Because of the FM nature of it, you could probably do some really cool real-time effects. I urge you to experiment with this. We've been talking about Squaresoft a lot lately. I'd like to talk about one of their composing techniques that's used in a lot of Final Fantasy games. Mono mode is essential if you're trying to stick to SNES limitations for eventual hardware playback. C700 can sometimes drop notes if you don't have all your samples set to mono, especially if you're trying to stick to 8 voices. My suggestion is to stick to the limitations. Set the voice allocation to the same channel and never exceed 8 channels. Final Fantasy 6 and 7 used an effect called Legato, or some MML drivers called it slurs. It's an effect where you play one note and then instantly change the pitch to the next. It's achieved by setting mono on your sample and then overlapping the notes. Though some DAWs may have some issues with this. I could never get this to work in Reason, for example. Glide is another word for portamento. It's similar to legato in that it slides to the next note, but it does it at a slower rate. You can set the rate right here. Another example that you can use this effect on is bending bass notes, for instance. Speaking of pitch bending, well, it looks like this video may be 25 minutes instead of 20. Oh well. MIDI has the ability to use several effects for the channel. It uses a method called continuous controllers. While it's technically up to the synthesizer or sampler to determine how these controllers are used, C700 has support for predetermined general MIDI standards. For example, controller 1 is mapped to modulation, which is vibrato. Controller 7 is mapped to the channel's volume. Controller 11 is a secondary volume mixer, but you'll want to be very careful because the SNES has a limited volume dynamic range. Mixing at very low volumes may give you very poor results, though the ADSR on that channel isn't affected by this. And controller 10 is for panning. You can also use pitch bending. By default, C700 will bend at a range of 2 semitones, but you can set it to bend to a maximum of 24 semitones. If you're doing something like bending a bass note to another, you can figure out the range of how far you want that note to bend, set the bend depth to the corresponding number, and then draw it in with your MIDI sequencer or use your MIDI sequencer's envelope features if it has it. As mentioned before, you have a limitation of 128 kHz for your output. If your sample goes over this, then the pitch will loop back around. A good example of this would be the time gate sound effect from Chrono Trigger. The biggest con to using controllers is that C700 handles storing them when logged very poorly, as its memory management is not very good. Basically, the controllers eat up a lot of your ARAM, filling it with sequence data. If your main goal is to output to an SPC file, extensive use of controllers should be avoided. You can mitigate this by outputting to an SNES ROM file instead, and I'll explain how that works right now. C700 has an amazing feature that makes it so that you can output to an SPC or an SNES ROM file, assuming you downloaded the playercode.bin file as shown to you at the beginning of this video. To log the file, you must set the start position of the song, the loop position if there is one, and the end position. Sometimes C700 will glitch out and not time the loop properly. The only thing you can do in those cases is to figure out the timing of where it's messing it up and add or subtract accordingly. To log the song, you simply just play the song from start to finish. The best tip I can give to you is to make sure that nothing else is running on your computer so that your DAW doesn't stutter while it's playing the song back, as it will log that as well. As mentioned before, the sequence data is stored in ARAM along with any sound effects, samples, and any echo effects that you might have stored in the song. Because C700 doesn't store sound effects data, this gives us a bit more room for the sequence data. However, if you use too many controllers, your SPC file may crash. The reason is because your MIDI sequencer is sending C700 more sequence information than it needs, and C700 is logging too much junk data. That junk data eats up the available ARAM and then crashes the sequence upon playback. If you're happy with the way the song came out, but you don't care that it can't output to an SPC file, then you can also output it to an SNES ROM file. When you do that, the sequence is stored in ROM data and then streamed to the ARAM in chunks. This allows the song to play in its entirety. For example, a project I did last year that I gave to Hiroki Kikuta as a gift allowed me to store a 40-minute song into a 2 MB ROM. So there you have it. Those are the fundamentals for making SNES music with C700, but there's much more to SNES music than throwing notes into a VST. One may think the SNES sound is defined by its echo and other features, but depending on your favorite soundtrack, there technically isn't a specific SNES sound. The sound design depends on your creativity and how you want it to sound. Games like Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6 define their own sound by having different vibrato styles, different samples, different echo settings, etc. Your only limitations is 64K of RAM and 8 voice polyphony. Want to make a Mega Drive/Genesis song? You can. Want to make a Neo Geo BIOS theme? Here you go. Want to make an N64 song? Not a problem. Well, that's going to do it for me today. I sped through a lot of it, but I didn't make 20 minutes. But I really do want to thank you all for joining me on this journey, and I really do hope that this tutorial helps some of you figure out C700. There really aren't enough tools out there for SNES music. Who knows, maybe someday that might change. Anyways, remember to like, comment, and subscribe.